Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of January of 2023. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First, we're going to discuss the situation on the ground, and let's discuss the Kupiansk frontline. As you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, they attacked the Ukrainian positions using artillery and so on, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 40 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. The main area where the Ukrainians accumulated their forces is Sinkovka. This is the front. This is the north border barrier from the Ukrainian side in Kupiansk front line, and they were attacking the area near Ivanovka. This is the battle line which the Ukrainians were trying to use during the previous months as the main bridgehead to attack in direction of Kotlarovka, Novoselovska, Kuzyumovka. In the global scope, this is the bridgehead to attack Svatova. Furthermore, the Russians reported that as a result of previous 24 hours clashes, the Ukrainians lost around 3 commandos groups near Tabakaevka, near Nivoyska, and near Stelmachovka in these 3 years. As you can see, the front line has been stabilized in this area, and as you can see, the main clashes between parties were done by using the small tactical groups, small commandos groups, and so on, from both sides. When talking about Liman front line, today we have very interesting update from this area. And first of all, let's take a look at this map, and we're gonna see that the Russian sources map has been updated. Now the Russians chose the town by the name of Dibrova, this one, as the town that located in the gray zone. And this is the reason why the Russian source map has been updated is the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. Today the Russians reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to destroy the Ukrainian M777 howitzer exactly in the area of Dibrova. So that means that the Ukrainians were able to move their artillery as close as possible to Dibrova, and now the Ukrainians using the outskirts of Dibrova attacks Kramatorsk on the everyday basis. Furthermore, when talking about the losses during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 120 soldiers and something around 9 armored vehicles in this area. So as you can see, according to the numbers of the Ukrainian losses, we see that the Ukrainians are pretty effective, pretty activated in this area. They are attacks from the north in direction Chervonopopovka, Zhitlovka, and they managed to develop their bridgehead. And today we see that they managed maybe not to enter Dibrova, but they're very close, and I believe maybe that the Russians are forced to step back from this town because of the risk of being encircled in this area. So I believe that now the Russians step back in direction, and now they have their positions on the north part of this forest and on the west part of Kramatorsk and the north, and in the forest that located on the northwest. So they get as close as possible to their main forces, and the Ukrainian pushes in this area. We will come back to this area one more time, but now let's move to furthermore. As you can see, the Russians destroyed the Ukrainian Grad, this like artillery MRLS system that located near Serebryanka, and another one was destroyed in the town by the name of Chansk that located on the border with Russian Federation. The Ukrainians were using this Grad system to attack Belgorod district and so on, and this one was the Ukrainians were using to attack Kramatorsk, and from now on they are not able to do this anymore. When talking about Bakhmut, today we got a lot of very interesting updates from this town. When talking about the artillery duels, the Ukrainian lost another M777 howitzer. As a result of the previous 24 hours clashes, the Ukrainians lost in Bakhmut around 90 soldiers, something around 14 armored vehicles. But today, during the previous 24 hours, we received at least 2 confirmation from 2 sides. From Prigozhin, this is the head of Wagner, of the main forces, who tries to storm Bakhmut these days, and from the Institute of Study of War. They made their own report about the situation in Bakhmut, and both sides and Prigozhin, the Wagners, and the Ukrainians either confirms that the situation in Bakhmut is critical, is complicated, that both sides had a lot of losses in Bakhmut, and the Russians and the Ukrainians. Furthermore, the Institute of Study of War reported that the Russians completely stopped or were slowed down in this area. And when talking about Bakhmut now, the Russians try to establish their positions, try to prepare trenches, try to hold the territory they managed to take during the December offensive operation in Bakhmut. Furthermore, when talking about the head of Wagner, he said that Bakhmut is very difficult to take. He told us that there are around 500 defense line inside of Bakhmut. So imagine yourself, every single 3 meters there is another line of defense. So this is a very powerful fortress, and I believe that this is the reason why the Russians decided to stop. Furthermore, we discussed many times about deployment map, and we saw that during the previous 2 months, during, let's say, this January, December, and the end of November, the Ukrainians managed to do around 2 or 3 fully loaded rotations. So they brought one army in the end of November that were reduced or that got a lot of damage from the Russians. Then they moved this army completely out, and by the end of December they deployed completely another army in Bakhmut, fully loaded, fresh, with the fresh blood, with fresh forces, with the fresh spirit, and so on. And the Russians couldn't crack this army, and because as far as I see, the Russians didn't do any rotation process. They mobilized the ex-prisoners. It's Wagner's, it's a private military company. They have their army. They attacked this army, and by the, let's say, by the middle of the second Ukrainian army, or by the beginning of the second Ukrainian army, the Russians decided to stop and to maybe to change their plans, to change their tactic, or maybe the attack in direction of Bakhmut was some kind of a trap, or some kind of situation that allow the Russians to force the Ukrainians to move as much as possible forces on this area, because we discussed this situation many times as well, that from the Ukrainian side we see that the Ukrainian regular professional army fights in Bakhmut, and when talking about the private company fights in this area. Of course, they're very professional, they're very cool, they're very well trained, but this is not the regular army. This private military company has some limitation in reserves, in support, in supply, and so on. So, and I believe that these reserves maybe came to the end, or maybe these small private company did the thing they were put for in this area. We will discuss this a little bit later. Furthermore, when talking about Bakhmut, we received some updates that some Ukrainian forces refused to follow the orders from 16th Mechanized Brigade, and they report about they decided to step back and leave this area and so on. So the regular situation when talking about the Ukrainians. A lot of very interesting updates are coming from 2 towns by the name of Kramatorsk and Drushkovka, these 2 towns. If you remember, a few days ago, on the 31st of December, we discussed the situation yesterday, and on the 31st of December, if you remember, the Ukrainians attacked a small college, schools, some building in Makiivka, the town that located on the east from Donetsk, and as a result of that attack, a lot of Russians the Russians had a lot of losses, and I believe, and most of the military experts are saying that as a revenge to that situation, the Russians during the previous hours were attacking the Ukrainians' positions, and two of these positions are located in the town by the name of Drushkovka. There is a railroad station in this area, and another one in Kramatorsk, it's like heart of Donbas Arc operation. Now, when talking about Kramatorsk, the Russians attacked the positions of Foreign Legion in this area, and as a result of that attack with missiles, around 130 soldiers from Foreign Legion. The losses of the Ukrainian side among the Foreign Legionnaires were around 130 soldiers. But when talking about Drushkovka, the Ukrainians lost around 120 soldiers, something around 2 HIMARS, 4 vampires and 6 armored vehicles. So the Ukrainians brought some reinforcement to the railroad station. They were trying to get these armored vehicles, HIMARS, infantry. They were trying to deploy. It's like a very long process, and the Russians attacked during this process the Ukrainians in the town by the name of Drushkovka, and you saw the losses. So that's a lot. When talking about these two towns, the Ukraine lost around 250 soldiers and a lot of artillery systems. Furthermore, when talking about Kramatorsk, with another attempt of attack, the Russians managed to destroy 2 HIMARS systems. So when calculating these two towns, the Ukrainians just for one night lost around 4 MLS systems, like 4 HIMARS and 4 vampires. Furthermore, when talking about and that's it about this area. When talking about Donetsk area itself, as you can see, the Ukrainians, the Russians stopped doing artillery duels, or at least we stopped receiving any updates about artillery duels, because from during the previous 24 hours, the Russians were attacking the towns like Nivolska, like the Ukrainians on the west side from Marinka. The Russians were attacking Kurakhova and so on, but we haven't received any updates about any artillery duels in this area. Furthermore, we haven't received during the previous 24 hours any updates about attack against radar station of counter battery warfare from the Russian side, so there is no update about this. And when talking about the south of Ukraine, the Ukrainian lost during the previous 24 hours around 30 soldiers and something around 5 armored vehicles. And the Russians were attacking the same thing, their commandos, scouts, some positions, Ukraine, and so on, nothing more. And when talking about Zaporozhye area, the Russians destroyed another warehouse near Gulay Polye. So we discussed this situation in Zaporozhye for many times during the previous 4 or 5 days. The Russians have concentrated on this area, and they destroyed a lot of ammo depots, fuel depots, a lot of artillery systems in this area. And furthermore, we got another update that the Russians destroyed near Kamyanskaya and near Gulay Polye, near these two towns, the Ukrainians lost 2 howitzers D-30. So as you can see, we are in the active phase of the winter campaign. Both sides attacks each other. There are very lot of losses from the Russian side. There are a lot of losses from the Ukrainian side, but we still haven't seen the main strike. We haven't seen the main strike because all these things we see is just some kind of maneuvers when both sides try to stretch the enemy to reduce their army, but we still haven't seen the main strike. And today we got 2 important updates from Western countries. And one of them was from the head of army of Kharkiv region. There is like some kind of head of of administration part of entire army of Kharkiv area, and another one we received from the British intelligence. And these 2 sources reported about very soon upcoming attack from the Russian side in direction of Kharkiv. Now let's discuss this in more details. When talking about the head of Ukrainian military administration of Kharkiv, he reported that the Russians managed to accumulate around 200,000 army on the border with Kharkiv, in Belgorod. And he said that the Russians are planning to attack in direction of Kharkiv, but not to storm Kharkiv, not to enter Kharkiv. Of course, this is not the main purpose of this army. The main purpose of this army is to cut Kharkiv from Kiev. So if the Russians, according to his words, wants to cut Kharkiv from Kiev, that means that the Russians will attack somewhere in the middle between Sumy and Kharkiv. This is Sumy, this is Kharkiv, so they need to attack somewhere here and to cut at least these 2 railroads. The first railroad moves from Kharkiv to Sumy, and another railroad moves from Kharkiv to Poltava. And he says that the Russians wants to do this just with one purpose, just with one reason, is that they want to cut the Ukrainian forces who are located on the east side of Ukraine on the front line with Kiev front line. So this attack will allow the Russians to cut the 2 main railroads that moves through Kharkiv and that moves through Krasnograd, these 2. in direction of Poltava, and of course from Poltava this railroad goes to Kiev, goes to the west part of Ukraine. This attack in direction to cut these two railroads will allow the Russians to attack Kiev from the north, and from this perspective, like first week, the Ukrainians will have forces, will have some army to defend against the forces that attacks the Ukraine from the north, from the territory of Belarus. But in a week, this army will be completely collapsed and destroyed, because mainly it's a territory defense, and the main Ukrainian forces are located on the east, and the Ukrainians won't be able even to redeploy some reserves to the north, because main railroads will be cut off. Of course, the Ukrainians still have possibilities to attack in direction of to move their forces through Dnipro and Zaporozhye, and for this, in this case, we know that there is that the Russians have been activated on Zaporozhye Gulay Pole. Maybe the Russians plans to attack from Zaporozhye in direction to the north with the same purpose, to cut the railroads that moves from east part of Ukraine, from Donbas Arc operation in direction of Kiev. So one attack from the north, from Belgorod and Kursk region, to cut Kharkiv from Kiev, another one from Zaporozhye to the north in direction of Pavlograd to cut let's say Donbas forces from Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and that means that this attack will allow the Russians to cut these forces from Kiev. So like the plan is to encircle a very big Ukrainian army in Donbas. And this is the reason why the Russians started storming Bakhmut in December. And the main reason was, as you understand, to force the Ukrainians to deploy their army in Bakhmut. They did two deployment process, and believe me, they weren't able to move these forces for rotation somewhere very far from this front line. All we can say that the major part of Ukrainian army is located between Kharkiv and let's say Gulay Pole, Ugledar, on this line. So this is the area where the Ukrainians managed to deploy their entire army. Or maybe 70 or 80% of their army. When talking about the rest of Ukraine, there are a lot of forces, but mainly it's a territory defense forces with very old equipment, without artillery systems. So it's completely two different armies. And if when talking about the Russians, I don't think it's going to be it won't be a very big problem to reduce this army on this part of Ukraine, because just one more time, territory defense forces. This is about the words of the head of military administration of Kharkiv. The Britain intelligence gives a little bit different situation. They're saying that the Russians are going to attack at least maybe as a first stage of this special operation or something like this. The Russians, according to Britain intelligence, United Kingdom intelligence, are planning to attack along Oskol River. So this is Oskol River. So they're planning to attack in this direction, in direction of Kupiansk, and another attack in this direction, at the same direction of Kupiansk. So they're going to move along the river from both sides of the river, and the main purpose of this attack is to encircle 30,000 soldiers, 30,000 army that located on Kupiansk-Liman front line. As you can see, these goals are much less than the goals that were described by the head of military administration of Kharkiv. But from this perspective, this operation is also very dangerous. If you remember, we discussed this operation of Kupiansk many times, and we understand why the Russians may want to achieve these goals. And the main things that the Russians want to restore by this counter-offensive operation in Kharkiv area is to restore the railroad that connects Svatova and the mainland, or to be more precise, with the Russian Federation. If we take a look at Svatova, we see that there is a railroad that moves to the south, but this railroad is cut. There are a lot of bridges that were destroyed in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Then to the south, all these bridges, a lot of bridges are destroyed, but the Russians still need. And as you can see, there are no connections from the south with the mainland with LPR or DPR. So this is the reason the Russians want to reduce their logistic expenses by restoring the railroad let's say, Valuki, Urazova, Dvurechная, Kupinsk, Svatova. This part of railroad they want to restore. And of course, furthermore, if they restore this railroad, as you can see, this railroad moves very close to Oskol River. So anyway, the Russians need to create some kind of buffer, and they need to create this buffer as long as possible. So I think that I created this line just to attack the direction of Russian attack. When talking about the real buffer that the Russians need to be protected against the attack from HIMARS system, from M777, the Russians, in this case, the Russians need to restore every single square meter they lost during the let's say the Ukrainian offensive operation in Kharkiv area. So they need to restore something like this. I can't tell you if the Russians are able to take control over Izium with this operation. If they need to take Izium, I don't think that they need this, but to create the front line along this Seversky Donetsk River, then along this Rocket at Skol River, and to return control over Liman, maybe this is a possible solution. In this case, around 30,000 army of Ukrainians will be encircled on Liman-Kupiansk front line, because there are going to be just few ways to evacuate from this area, mainly through Seversky Donetsk in direction of Slaviansk. But these days we are going to see, I believe, that there are no bridges in this area. Of course, it will take a lot of time to redeploy the Ukrainian army dislocated in this area. Of course, don't forget about some kind of surprise effect that the Russians are able to do. So this operation might bring a lot of problems for the Ukrainians. So as you can see, two possible operations: to attack just a small part of Ukrainian army in Kupiansk-Liman front line, and another projection is to attack from Zaporozhye from the south to cut the railroads, and to attack to cut Kharkiv from the Kiev from the north. And with this attack, the Russians will be able to encircle the entire Ukrainian army. And after that, they will I'm not sure how long they need. Of course, the Ukrainians will try to make penetration, breaking through, and so on. But anyway, with these two attacks, the Russians will be able to do the most important thing. They will be able to cut supply and support of Western vehicles, Western HIMARS, and Western tanks, artilleries, and so on in direction of Donbass. And of course, every single day, the army that located in this area will become more and more, less and less powerful. And of course, from the other side, the Russians will become more and more powerful. The same situation. So this is about the projections, about these all these things, and I try to understand, try to analyze the situation, and then try to classify the Russian goals. So how many, and I discover for myself that there might be a lot of course, goals for the Russians, and I try to classify them. And let's say we can say that there are there is like ground goals for the Russians, like to develop their ground, their territory, their bridgehead, and so on. Another possible goals that the Russians can achieve and want to achieve during the possible upcoming offensive period from their side is, let's say, to stretch the Ukrainian army. Of course, the Russians may want to reduce the Ukrainian army. This is also as an option, as a goal for the Russians. And let's say, but every single goal needs to bring the Russians some achievements, some benefits, and from the other side, the Ukrainians should lose something by the fact that the Russians achieve this or that goal. When talking about, let's say, developing on the ground, of course, I don't think that the Russians need to attack somewhere in the north in direction of Chernigov or Sumy, because the Russians are able to take this ground, but this ground doesn't have any value for the Russians. They don't have plants, industrial zones, there are no ports, there's nothing there, just a poor population that you need to feed, you need to pay them salaries, and so on. When talking about ground development, of course, the best situation for the Russians when talking about ground development is to attack Nikolaev, Kherson, and Odessa, because if the Russians are able to take this ground, they will receive a lot of benefits. They will be able to cut the Ukraine from the port, from the sea. They will be able to start development in direction of South Ukrainian nuclear power plant. But we see that the Russians from this side left this bank of the river, so we understand that when talking about the Russian goals, we understand that the territory at this point, at this stage of this war, is not the main thing that the Russians want to achieve. They don't need territory. When talking about stretching the army, that means that, simply say, when we're talking about stretching the enemy's army, we're talking about opening another front line. And of course, one of like the best solutions for these purposes is to open front lines somewhere in the border with Belarus. Yes, this is a very nice option. This is a very nice goals that the Russians can achieve, and by that they will be able to reduce the power of Ukraine army. But from the other side, the Russians will be able to make situation of the forces in Zaporozhye, Donbas, Lugansk much more easier than we have right now. But from the other side, we can say that if the Russians opens another front line somewhere on the territory of Belarus, we will have a lot of big problems in the world, because all over the world the countries will blame the Belarus, will make another sanctions, will make a lot of problems for the Russians in this case. And furthermore, maybe for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks the Russians will be able to achieve some success on the north, but later the Ukrainians will be able to redeploy their force from Donbas somewhere in the north, and then we're going to see the same picture as we see in Donbas. The Russians will stack, will slow down, and then they will stop completely. And from the other, and also they will lose their, let's say, surprise effect from the north. So another important thing when talking about, let's say, another goal that the Russians can achieve is to force the Ukrainians to sign peace agreement. And this is a completely different goal that the Russians want to achieve. And of course, to attack from the north, they are able to do this by attacking Kyiv. So by attacking from the north, the Russians are able to achieve 2 goals. First, to stretch the Ukrainian army, and the second one, by attacking the Kyiv, they will be able to force, or at least to make something to force the Ukrainians to sign a peace agreement. But another thing, one more time, in 2 or 3 weeks, the Ukrainians will be able to redeploy enough of forces, and this surprise effect and these goals will be completely collapsed from the Russian side. So we understand that to complete every single goals we discussed, like to force, to sign peace agreement, to stretch the Ukrainian army, to take control over more territories, important territories, the Russians need to achieve one goal. They need to reduce or encircle or to block the Ukrainian army. And as soon as the Russians are able to do this, if the Russians are able to collapse or encircle or pin down the Ukrainian army in Donbas area, then they will be able to achieve everything they want. The Russians will be able to return Nikolaev, Kherson, Odessa. The Russians will be able to open the second front line on the north, and furthermore, they will be able to do this with less forces. With less forces, they will be able to enter some territories, to build checkpoints and many other things. And meanwhile, during the time, they will be able to move more and more forces on these territories. So we understand that if the Russians want to break the situation, they don't even need to destroy the Ukrainian army in Donbas. They don't need to do this. They need to block them there. And this is the most important difference, because this is like the most fresh goal that I discovered for myself, that we discussed many times, like to reduce army, to take control over territories, to attack Kyiv and so on. But we never discussed about another goal is to block the Ukrainian army. In this case, you are not destroying the army, because I believe that the Russians today are not able to destroy the Ukrainian army, at least at this configuration, but they can to block this army. And I believe that this is exactly that the Russians are planning to do during January and February. And this is the reason why we saw all this masquerade, all this balagan and Bakhmut with many losses from many sides, is to force the Ukrainians to accumulate all their army on the line from Kupiansk to Donetsk, Avdiivka, Gulay-Polye. And as soon as the Ukrainians did that, now the Russians need to block this army from Zaporozhye and from Kharkiv. And this is exactly what the military administration of Kharkiv was trying to tell us. And this is exactly what the United Kingdom intelligence was trying to tell us as well. So we'll see, of course, we'll follow this situation. Very interesting, very clever plan. Furthermore, don't forget that according to the Ukrainian projections, on the 5th of January, so tomorrow the 3rd, and like the day after tomorrow, according to the Ukrainian sources, the Russians are planning to announce about global entire mobilization from the Russian side. And if they do this, that means that everything we discussed today is true, and the Russians are planning to exactly what we say. Because even during this encirclement process, it's not even encirclement process, it's blockade process. And it's not the difference between encirclement, blockade, and all this situation is that the Russians will cut the main railroads. First, the south one and the north one. The Ukrainians will still have possibility to use regular roads, but I can't imagine how the Ukrainians move their tanks from, let's say, Slaviansk in direction of Kiev using the railroads. It will take weeks or maybe months before they're able to do this. To send, let's say, imagine yourself to send 100 tanks somewhere from Kramatorsk using the local roads in direction of the north of Ukraine. Of course, it's possible, and if there are no any other option, the Ukrainians will be forced to do this. But I think that Ukrainians won't do this. In this case, the Ukrainians will try to make counter-offensive local operation from Kharkiv in direction of the Russian army that moves from Belgorod and Kursk in direction of the south, and the same local offensive operation from Dnipro, Zaporozhye in direction of offensive Russian army that moves from Zaporozhye to the north. It's going to be a very grand battle, I believe so. At least if the Russians are not going to do this, I don't see any sense of this special operation, because the Ukrainians do have support, do have supply, and anyway, somebody needs to risk, or the Russians or the Ukrainians, they need to risk. First, they need to plan everything, and then they need to risk, because if these parties are going to continue what we see right now, this configuration of the front line we will see even in 10 years without any progress, without any movements from both sides. Furthermore, during the years we are going to see a lot of problems in Ukraine, in Russian Federation, and everybody understands this, and everybody wants to turn the situation and to change the state of the front line and to change everything. So that's why they need to risk. Anyway, we're going to see this. I believe that in a day or two, we're going to receive more updates, more information. So let's see. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you you can condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.